Is every culture as good as every other one? That is a question that I want to take up pretty seriously in this episode of the show. And it's a question, obviously, that is on a lot of people's minds. Cultural relativism is this kind of broad catch-all term for the idea that, well, they do things one way in one place, another way in another place. And obviously that's true in some respects, right? I mean, that it's no better to eat tacos than it is to eat hamburgers. It's no better to eat hamburgers than it is to eat tacos, as far as I'm concerned. It's purely a matter of preference, and these are things, non-existential differences that we can talk about. But what about things like polygamy, right? What about worse things like infanticide or eugenics, right? Things that they do in some cultures and not in others. What about incredibly punitive laws about sexuality, right? These things, there's a kind of incoherent idea that we have floating around in our society that, well, it's all fine and dandy, everyone can do everything, but we have certain moral absolutes, right? We want rights for gay people everywhere, but we want to be sensitive about Muslim cultures, or we want to be sensitive about this, that, and the other, and so we have this weird incoherence where we believe certain things very passionately, and yet we also have this weird relativism that comes out of our like an over extended desire for sensitivity. And this is an idea which is very, very ancient. I've talked about Herodotus before, and when we had Tom Holland on, he mentioned this idea that custom is king. And we were talking about the fact that that's not actually a position of cultural relativism. Herodotus was talking about the fact that where you grow up and the assumptions that you're surrounded by shape you in really important ways. But there are certain things that Herodotus proclaims are foul, like, for example, the Babylonian custom of temple prostitution. He says this is hideous, this is bad. And so there's obviously limits to what you can do, and there are moral absolutes in the universe for Herodotus, but also there's a tremendous variety. And there's something in this of Burke as well, right? There's a tremendous variety in the ways that people behave, customs and patterns. But fundamentally, right, either there is such a thing as justice, that is good and bad, a right and wrong way to organize society, or it's all just relativist. It's all just relative. Right? Those are the two possibilities. That's the question we're taking up. And it is the fundamental question on the table in the first book of Plato's Republic. I've talked a lot about how we're going to get to Plato's Republic. This is the masterwork, really, of the great philosopher Plato, who once again is working primarily in the 4th century BC. And probably we're looking at about a date of somewhere around 380 BC or so for the Republic. We don't know for sure, and Plato's dating is always difficult to get into, but we can place it vaguely there, certainly after the death of Socrates, and quite crucially after the eruption and subsequent failure of the oligarchic 30 tyrants, they're sometimes called. We're going to get into that as a context in which the Republic is written. Y'all, I am loving the stuff that I have gotten from Public Goods. You know that I'm big into fitness, big into health, and one of the major things about that is that a lot of the stuff you get in the grocery store can have all these weird additives and products with like a million syllable names and all this stuff. Public Goods sells you basics that are clean, thoughtfully designed, beautiful, and made from clean ingredients. They look great in my kitchen. I love their dish soap. This is not just for food. It's for like all kinds of basics. They also have some amazing food though. They've got ramen, which I really love, which I eat with their chopsticks, which are also very beautiful. The whole thing is just beautifully packaged, beautifully presented, and I trust the brand. So I know that you're getting stuff free from additives, safe for humans, animals, and the environment. I worked out an amazing deal with them just for my listeners. You can get $15 off your first Public Goods order with no minimum purchase, which is insane. That's so cool. You don't have to buy like an extravagant amount. You just get $15 off no matter what if you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout. So that's publicgoods.com/heretics to receive $15 off your first order. You can get all kinds of great stuff there. It's all free of additives and preservatives. Plus, it looks great. Check it out. So let me just set the scene, right, of what this work is, because this is one of those ones. I'm only doing book 1 today, and I'm going to do an episode on every book, because this is one of those ones that's just so enormous. It's had such a profound influence on the way that we think, that we can't, get our heads around it in just an hour, right? This I've mentioned before the great British philosopher A.N. Whitehead, who said the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. I do not mean the systematic scheme of thought which scholars have doubtfully extracted from his writings. I allude to the wealth of general ideas scattered through them. So there's no escaping this work, and we come back to it again and again because it is so rich, and even the questions that it raises and the things it doesn't answer, even the failures in it, are productive. So I'm going to do this, but because this is such an enormous book, right, we need to approach it with care, and we need to approach it without fear, right? So I just want to set the scene and sort of set up what this book is. It's called Republic because that's Cicero's Latin translation, res publica, which means literally the public thing or the public affair. It's the way of doing things in public. And that's quite different from, I've talked about the Republic as the tripartite regime, right? As the kind of blend of democracy, monarchy, and aristocracy, and in Polybius and all of that, right? But this is a more general idea that translates the Greek word politeia. And that's, once again, from polis, which is also where we get our word politics, right? It's the way of doing life together. And as Aristotle famously observes, this is natural to us. Wherever there are humans, there are rituals and traditions and rules associated with communal life. And this question of justice, right? Is there such a thing as a right and wrong way to do that? And what does that look like? That is the fundamental question of politics. It's why this book is such a foundational text for Western political philosophy. And so he's looking at this question, Plato is, in the context of a democracy, that is, Athens has returned to its democracy from after the 30 tyrants. But Plato himself is highly skeptical of democracy and of democratic sentiment, which sort of reduces everybody to this one flat level, which he believes is kind of a rabble, right? And he's considering not just what is the best form of government, but he's considering, what is the way even that we live together, in part because the democratic government of Athens had murdered his great teacher, his mentor, Socrates, the man he loved and learned from, he spent his life really trying to pass along what Socrates meant to people. And in some sense that I think I'm going to get into as I talk about book 1, right? Plato is dealing, I think, with a little bit of his cynicism, that once you had seen your state do that, once you had seen the state participate in such an act of injustice, you might have to reckon with a kind of temptation to cynicism, that there is no such thing as justice. And this is placed in the mouth of the sophist Thrasymachus, this idea that justice is just the will of the stronger. And we're going to read several passages in which Thrasymachus says this, but I really think that Plato is grappling with that argument, not only as something that sophists, contemporaries of Socrates were saying, but as something that he's tempted to believe, tempted to despair, in light of this, first the 30 tyrants, and then the execution of Socrates. And the 30 tyrants, remember, are in the background of this, in part because the two leading members of this tyrannical leadership were Critias and Theramenes. And Critias had been a student of Socrates. And so Socrates was suspected. He was not, the regime of the 30 tyrants was extremely cruel and involved the murder or exile of people who were thought of as opposed to the regime. And since Socrates was enabled to remain in the city, he was suspected of having collaborated, especially because he had been part of this, high Athenian intellectual culture, which generated a lot of suspicion as being, kind of a power play, these sort of powers behind the throne. And Socrates, having taught one of the tyrants and having been allowed to remain in Athens during the reign of the tyrants, was kind of thought of as potentially suspect in that regard, as well as the famous charges against him corrupting the youth and teaching other gods than the ones the city worships. And in Plato's Apology, which is the sort of the represented defense speech of Socrates before those who had him on trial, Socrates says, "When the oligarchy came into power, the 30 commissioners in their turn summoned me and 4 others to the round chamber and instructed us to go and fetch Leon of Salamis from his home for execution. This was, of course, only one of many instances in which they issued such instructions, instructions, their object being to implicate as many people as possible in their crimes. So he's washing his hands here, right, of the 30 tyrants. He says, on this occasion, however, I again made it clear, not by my words, but by my actions, that the attention I paid to death was zero, if that's not too unrefined a claim, but that I gave all my attention to avoiding doing anything unjust or unholy. Powerful as it was, that government did not terrify me into doing a wrong action. When we came out of the rotunda, the other four went to Salamis and arrested Leon, but I simply went home. And so he sees the democratic government consumed with paranoia in the wake of its loss in the Peloponnesian War. Remember that we've talked about that before, the terrible defeats that Athens had suffered in the Peloponnesian War at the hands of Sparta, the 30 tyrants and their brutal regime, and then the democratic regime, which basically, you know, is so afraid of heterodoxy that it has to wipe Socrates out from its midst as subversive. In the midst of all this, though, Plato is stringing out this idea of a Socrates who does what is right despite the unjust state in which he finds himself, be it an oligarchy, be it a democracy, be it any form of government, right? Socrates resists the claims of the unjust upon him. He says, I did not pay attention. I was not afraid of death. I was commanded to execute somebody unjustly. I did not do it. I resisted. And so the basis for that resistance, the basis of justice, right, is at issue in this work, in the Republic, which is, again, this sort of massive dialogue. The characters in it are Socrates, major characters in it, right, are Socrates, Cephalus, who is the kind of old host of the house where they end up having this conversation, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are sons of Ariston, and Ariston is Plato's father, so these are Plato's brothers. Polemarchus, who's a character, remember that the dramatic date of this is before the 30 tyrants. Polemarchus was later executed by the 30. And Thrasymachus, the famous sophist who ends up making the kind of just everything is power argument, which is a sort of a Nietzschean argument, right? The idea that if you just assert yourself, that's justice. You make up your own values. Hey, it is getting to be time almost for the fall semester over at the Ancient Language Institute, and these guys are amazing. They're experts at teaching Latin and Ancient Greek. It doesn't matter what level you're starting out at. They are fantastic at introducing people to these incredible languages, which have been so wonderful in my life. They've meant so much to me. And this fall, they're adding a new language to their course offerings, which is Biblical Hebrew. If you want to go deeper into the scriptural tradition, if you want to know the texts that we talk about on this show more deeply and more profoundly, you cannot do better than to go to the Ancient Language Institute and learn one of these ancient languages. So it's ancientlanguage.com/heretics, and you can get started today. If you use the offer code heretics, you will get 15% off. Once again, they take students of all ages and experience levels. You can reach out to them and figure out what course is best for you, whether you want to give your kids the Latin education you never got, or you yourself want to study the classical tongues of Western civilization, or both. Go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics and use the offer code heretics for 15% off to get started today. Okay. So I'm going to read the opener of this, and then I'll talk about what's going on just at the very beginning. Remember that Plato is always doing things not just with the explicit arguments that are being made, but with the art and the drama of his dialogue. So this is Alan Bloom's translation. I've mentioned it before. His notes are amazing. The Republic. Very beginning, book 1. This is Socrates speaking. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, son of Ariston, to pray to the goddess. And at the same time, I wanted to observe how they would put on the festival, since they were now holding it for the first time. Now, in my opinion, the procession of the native inhabitants was fine, but the one the Thracians conducted was no less fitting a show. After we had prayed and looked on, we went off toward town. So already, this is what's called a katabasis. That's the first word. I went down, a going down katabaino. And this is a word that is used for going down into the underworld, right? A katabasis is what the great heroes of the epics do when they go down to the underworld. And so there's this sort of idea that you're sort of descending into the heart of things and coming back up out. This is a festival at the Piraeus, which is Athens' port. It's about 6 miles out of the city, and they're performing a festival for the first time to this Thracian god Bendis, who seems to be kind of analogous to Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon. She's this foreign goddess, but they're celebrating her in Athens, and that's why he mentions the Thracians. Let me read to you just for a second Bloom's note, just on this bit, just on the context. He says, The Piraeus was the place to find all the diversity and disorder that come from foreign lands. It was therefore the appropriate place in which to consider outlandish ways of life. Furthermore, it was a center of the Democratic Party. Sometime after the supposed date of the action of this dialogue, probably around 411 BC, in 404 BC, the Piraeus was the stronghold of the resistance against the despotic group of men known as the 30 Tyrants, who ruled Athens after its defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. In that resistance, the family of Cephalus, remember that's the host, it's going to be the host of this whole dialogue, especially Lysias, played a leading role. Polemarchus was executed by the tyrants. Socrates was suspected of sympathy with and influence over the leaders of the tyranny because several had been among his companions. And this is what we were just talking about, right? And the defense that he makes in the apology of himself in this regard. But Socrates' position in relation to the democracy remains ambiguous. The conversation in the Republic takes place in the shadow of the 30. They had much to do with the execution not only of Polemarchus, but also indirectly of Socrates. And the dialogue treats, at least in part, of the tyrannical ambitions of Socrates' companions. And so, as I was saying, right, even just this opening paragraph, just the setting, is rich with this context and this history, which you might not know. You need somebody like Bloom to tell you, right? But that's part of the art of Plato, right? Is he's setting us up now for the perfect opportunity to have this conversation. Well, what is right and wrong? How do we organize our lives together? So going on, right, catching sight of us from afar, as we were pressing homewards, Polemarchus, son of Cephalus, ordered his slave boy to run after us and order us to wait for him. The boy took hold of my cloak from behind and said, "Polemarchus orders you to wait." And I turned around and asked him where his master was. "He is coming up behind," he said. "Just wait." "Of course we'll wait," said Glaucon. A moment later, Polemarchus came along with Adimantus, Glaucon's brother, Niceratus, son of Nicias, and some others, apparently from the procession. Polemarchus said, "Socrates, I guess you two are hurrying to get away to town." "That's not a bad guess," I said. "Well," he said, "do you see how many of us there are?" "Of course," says Socrates. "Well then," he said, that's Polemarchus, "either prove stronger than these men or stay here." And Socrates says, "Isn't there still one other possibility? Our persuading you that you must let us go." "Could you really persuade," he said, "if we don't listen?" "There's no way," said Glaucon. "Well then, think it over, bearing in mind we won't listen." This first exchange, right, is one that I've had occasion to refer to before on this show, and it is one of the great conundrums of all Western philosophy, that in order to do philosophy, in order to discuss things like what's the best way of life, you have to actually already be in that philosophical conversation. And if people will not listen, if they're just going to scream at you, right, then they're actually not in that conversation. And there's no reasoning with people who are just operating by force. And that's the premise of this whole first book is force the only logic that we really need to obey? And Socrates is going to argue that no, there is actually another force which does not compel physically, but which is nevertheless something to which we are beholden. We have a responsibility to justice, even if it doesn't grab us physically or force us around using military might, right? Justice is a thing that we must obey. So let's get into the meat of this discussion. The first thing that really happens is that Cephalus, who is getting on in age, right? He's sort of the older patriarch of this whole discussion, although he's only in it for a little bit, right? He gives what you might consider a kind of traditional or knee-jerk assumption definition of justice, of what justice is. And this is reflective of the idea that I've talked about before, doxography, right? The idea that you kind of begin from cultural assumptions. You begin, and Aristotle really formalizes this, you begin by looking into what people think, just in general, but also previous philosophers before you, and then you take what's good and you alter what doesn't quite work. So that's your starting point. And Plato uses that technique here, but in a dramatic way. So Cephalus, who has said already that old age is sort of a blessing to him because it enables him to chill out a little bit, that he's not tormented by all these desires to mate and to do things like what you want to do when you're young. He's sort of more calm and sedate, and he doesn't worry too much about sophistical arguments. He says, "What I say wouldn't persuade many, perhaps. For know well, Socrates, that when a man comes near to the realization he will be making an end, fear and care enter him for things to which he gave no thought before. The tales told about what is in Hades, that the one who has done unjust deeds here must pay the penalty there, at which he laughed up to then, now make his soul twist and turn because he fears they might be true. whether it is due to the debility of old age, or whether he discerns something more of the things in that place, because he is already nearer to them, as it were. He is, at any rate, now full of suspicion and terror, and he reckons up his accounts, and considers whether he has done anything unjust to anyone. Now, the man who finds many unjust deeds in his life often wakes from his sleep in a fright as children do, and lives in anticipation of evil. For the man who is conscious in himself of no unjust deed, sweet and good hope is ever beside him, a nurse in his old age, as Pindar puts it. For you know, Socrates, he put it charmingly, when he said that whoever lives out a just and holy life, sweet hope accompanies, fostering his heart, a nurse of his old age, hope which most of all pilots the ever-turning opinion of mortals. How very wonderfully well he says that. For this I count the possession of money most worthwhile, not for any man, but for the decent and orderly one. The possession of money contributes a great deal to not cheating or lying to any man against one's will, and, moreover, to not departing for that other place frightened because one owes some sacrifices to a god or money to a human being. This concept of owing things is very important in the Republic. It's going to figure into the ultimate definition of justice that we come down on, even though it's not going to be quite what Cephalus says. Cephalus says next, it also has many other uses. But still, one thing reckoned against another, I wouldn't count this as the least thing, Socrates, for which wealth is very useful to an intelligent man. And then Socrates says, what you say is very fine indeed, Cephalus, but as to this very thing, justice, shall we so simply assert that it is the truth and giving back what a man has taken from another? Or is to do these very things sometimes just and sometimes unjust? So that's the first starting point of this discussion, is we have this kind of going assumption that the truth and giving things back that are owed is the essence of justice. And Socrates is going to complicate this and interrogate it and poke at it, right? Because that's what Socrates does. But note, right, that there's a very sensible and beautiful idea present in Cephalus, right, that you kind of forget as you move on in the dialogue, which is that once you get up to the gate of Hades, that is, once you start, counting your days on Earth, stuff suddenly gets very real to you, so that the abstractions of philosophy don't quite cut it anymore. You can't argue away your sense that, well, I'm going to die, right? And what will I leave behind? What will the world look like to me? Or what will the world look like after me, right? And so that context is really beautiful, to put Cephalus there at the beginning as they're about to entertain all these dialogues and discourses, because it stops you from entering into abstractions that nobody would really believe if you were at the gates of Hades. Hey, so I have this old college buddy. Maybe you've heard of him. I don't know, maybe not. His name is Michael Knowles. You know what I'm talking about? Knowles is a dear, dear friend of mine. I've been so delighted to watch his career and the wonderful work that he does at the Daily Wire. Now I am thrilled to tell you about his book and to commend it to you. It's called Speechless. And the idea behind it is, we all talk about political correctness. We all talk about cancel culture, woke culture, but we don't always know where it comes from. I mean, we don't have a sense that these are actually long-standing ideas that were incubated in radical groups for many, many decades. And what Knowles does in Speechless is he just gives you a scholarly account that is also very readable and very fun of how we got to this point and how political correctness took control of our basically world, which also includes some ideas about how we can fight back, which is the most important thing in my view. This is a great book. It's going to be read for a long time. You're going to want to get a copy. I have been devouring mine, and you can get it now at speechlessbook.com. I hate to say that Knowles did anything right, but he really did this book right, and it even has words in it. So go to speechlessbook.com and get yours. These ideas are bandied back and forth a bit. I don't want to bog us down too much with what happens in the next few pages, although I obviously believe you should go away and read the whole thing. But I want to focus now on what happens, the next major event that happens, which is that Thrasymachus breaks into this sort of genteel conversation that's being had about what justice is. And he breaks in with the scorn that only academics can muster, that everybody who's saying these traditional, conventional things is an idiot. Obviously, I know the answer. And this is a very recognizable persona. I think some of us have been this guy. I know I've been this guy in my worst moments. And here's Thrasymachus. Now, Thrasymachus had many times started out to take over the argument in the midst of our discussion, but he had been restrained by the men sitting near him, who wanted to hear the argument out. But when we paused and I said this, he could no longer keep quiet. Hunched up like a wild beast, he flung himself at us, as if to tear us to pieces. Then both Polemarchus and I got all in a flutter from fright, and he shouted out into our midst and said, "What is this nonsense that has possessed you for so long, Socrates? And why do you act like fools, making way for one another? If you truly want to know what the just is, don't only ask to gratify your love of honor by refuting whatever someone answers. You know that it is easier to ask than to answer, but answer yourself and say what you assert the just to be. And see to it you don't tell me that it is the needful, or the helpful, or the profitable, or the gainful, or the advantageous, but tell me clearly and precisely what you mean, for I won't accept it if you say such inanities." I was astounded when I heard him, and looking at him, I was frightened. I think that if I had not seen him before he saw me, I would have been speechless. And as it was, just when he began to be exasperated by the argument, I had looked at him first, so that I was able to answer him. And with just a trace of a tremor, I said, this is Socrates, remember, "Thrasymachus, don't be hard on us. If we are making any mistake in the consideration of the arguments, Polemarchus and I know well that we're making an unwilling mistake. If we were searching for gold, we would never willingly make way for one another in search and ruin our chances of finding it. So don't suppose that when we are seeking for justice, a thing more precious than a great deal of gold, we would ever foolishly give in to one another and not be as serious as we can be about bringing it to light. Don't you suppose that, my friend. Rather, as I suppose, we are not competent. So it's surely far more fitting for us to be pitied by you clever men than to be treated harshly." So he's got a bit of that Socratic twinkle in his eye in this response, but he's also saying, we are sincere in this. We're not, the accusation, which is often leveled that people who are seeking the truth are just doing it for their own interest, which is a theme, really, of what Thrasymachus is about to say and argue, right? Socrates, I think, truthfully, Plato's Socrates says, actually, we are trying to find useful ways that we can live our lives in a better way, right? So Socrates goes on later to turn this around and say, well, Thrasymachus, what do you say justice is? So he says, "You best of men, how could a man answer who, in the first place, does not know and does not profess to know?" Remember, this is a theme of Plato's Socrates, that he's the only one who knows what he doesn't know, right? And that is that he knows nothing. And who, in the second place, even if he does have some supposition about these things, is forbidden to say what he believes by no ordinary man. It's more fitting for you to speak, for you are the one who says he knows and can tell. Now, do as I say, gratify me by answering, and don't begrudge your teaching to Glaucon here and the others. After I said this, Glaucon and the others begged him to do as I said, and Thrasymachus evidently desired to speak so that he could win a good reputation, since he believed he had a very fine answer. But he kept up the pretense of wanting to prevail on me to do the answering. Finally, however, he conceded and then said, "Here is the wisdom of Socrates. Unwilling himself to teach, he goes around learning from others and does not even give thanks to them. When you say I learn from others, I said, you speak the truth, Thrasymachus. But when you say I do not make full payment in thanks, you lie, for I pay as much as I can. I am only able to praise. I have no money. How eagerly I do so when I think someone speaks well, you will well know as soon as you have answered, for I suppose you will speak well. Now listen," he said, "I say that the just is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Well, why don't you praise me? But you won't be willing." So this is supposed to be the big bombshell, right? And it is a thoroughly sophistical argument. And as it gets developed, and he has to tease it out because it's sort of unclear at the beginning, right? Who's the stronger? What kind of strength are you talking about, right? But essentially, this is the core of cultural relativism. It's to say, well, however the powerful are deeming it is just to act, that is what is just, and you're a fool if you obey because, and this is the key that most cultural relativists don't then follow up with, right? If that's true, if it's just what the law is in any given place, and that's just what's just, if it's just what the powerful say, well, then there's no reason why you should behave that way if it's not to your advantage, right? And so cultural relativism logically follows on into a kind of Nietzschean anarchy, right? That you just assert yourself against the law and do what's good for you. And so eventually, as Socrates sort of teases him out, that's what he ends up saying. So here's a slightly later passage. So this is Socrates says, let's consider it better. Wasn't it agreed that the rulers, when they command the ruled to do something, sometimes completely mistake what is best for themselves, while it is just for the ruled to do whatever the rulers command? Weren't these things agreed upon? I suppose so, he said. Well then, I said, also suppose that you're agreed that it is just to do whatever is disadvantageous for those who are the rulers and the stronger, when the rulers unwillingly command what is bad for themselves, and you assert it is just to do what they have commanded. In this case, most wise Thrasymachus, doesn't it necessarily follow that it is just for the others to do the opposite of what you say? For the weaker are commanded to do what is doubtless disadvantageous for the stronger. Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, said Polemarchus most clearly. So he's tying Thrasymachus in knots here by saying, well, sometimes surely the stronger, that is the rulers, be they tyrants, 30 tyrants, or the democratic leaders, or the tyrant, the one king, right? Whoever they be, right? If justice is just what's good for them and what they assert, whether they are good or bad, surely they get it wrong sometimes, right? Surely they get and so he's essentially trying to get Thrasymachus to realize that behind that idea of advantage, right, there's some absolute good. There's some absolute thing that lies behind even the idea, right, that justice is what's advantageous for the stronger. Hey guys, I wanted to let you know about a really cool deal that we have going on all through the month of July. We are giving away free We're Reading Homer and Screw You shirts. This is one of my favorite shirts, and it's one of our most popular, and you can get it for free in the month of July if you sign up for an annual VIP membership on Locals. You know about Locals. I talk about it all the time because I love it so much. It's a community that I founded after I decided that I had to get out of the reach of big tech. I didn't want anybody to own the relationship that I have with you. So when you become a Young Heretics VIP on Locals, you get episodes a week in advance without ads, but you also get a bunch of other stuff. I write exclusive articles, and then we discuss and kind of go deeper into some of the ideas that are raised on the episodes. Plus, there's lifestyle tips like lifting hacks and whiskey recs, cigar recs, all kinds of stuff like that. So you go to youngheretics.com/locals. You sign up for an annual membership. You screenshot your receipt and send it to me at promo@youngheretics.com. The first 50 people who do that in July will get a free shirt, and everybody who does it ever will get the amazing benefits of being a Young Heretics VIP. Really hope to see you there. Okay. And so Klavan now interrupts and he says, Thrasymachus himself agrees that the rulers sometimes command what is bad for themselves and that it is just for the others to do these things. That's because Thrasymachus set down that to do what the rulers bid is just, Polemarchus. And because, Klavan, he also set down that the advantage of the stronger is just. Once he had set both of these principles down, he further agreed that sometimes the stronger order those who are weaker and are ruled to do what is to the disadvantage of the stronger. On the basis of these agreements, the advantage of the stronger would be no more just than the disadvantage. But, said Klavan, he said that the advantage of the stronger is what the stronger believes to be to his advantage. That is what must be done by the weaker, and that is what he set down as the just. And so now there is an attempt, and Polemarchus next says, that's not what was said. And Socrates says, that doesn't make any difference. If Thrasymachus says it that way now, let's accept it from him. So he's saying, okay, now Thrasymachus has, under this scrutiny, has revised his position, right? Just what the stronger people think is right, what laws they make, even if they're wrong, right? That's what is called justice. But it's all a charade, right? Because it's just, they create these rules so that they can get whatever, money, strength, wealth, right? They can get the people to fight in their armies, they can get people to pay them taxes, all this stuff, whatever it is, that's all justice is. And you're a fool if you obey. You're a fool because it's not for your good, it's for the good of the powerful. Socrates now begins in earnest, now that he's gotten Thrasymachus down to this pure relativism, right? Because previously he had this sort of squishy position, well, sometimes they don't know what's good for them, but now he's gotten Thrasymachus down to this pure, it's all just power, right? It's all just games of power, assertions of power, and the attempt to one-up one another in terms of power. Now he begins gently to unpack this and to destroy Thrasymachus' argument. So Here's sort of where I think the beginning of it is. I'm at 341C for those of you following along in the Stephanus pages at home. Enough of this, I said, that is Socrates. Now tell me, is the doctor in the precise sense of whom you recently spoke, they've been using doctors. Doctors are often exemplary craftsmen. Is the doctor in the precise sense of whom you recently spoke a moneymaker or one who cares for the sick? Speak about the man who is really a doctor. He's saying the essence of the craft of medicine, of being a doctor, is it to make money? That is to get the advantage that you get out of it? Or is it to do the thing that is called doctoring, is called medicine? One who cares for the sick, he says. So he says being a doctor is caring for the sick. And what about the pilot? Is the man who is a pilot, in the correct sense, a ruler of sailors or a sailor? A ruler of sailors. I suppose it needn't be taken into account that he sails in the ship, and he shouldn't be called a sailor for that. For it isn't because of sailing that he is called a pilot, but because of his art and his rule over sailors. True, he said. Is there something advantageous for each of them? Certainly. And isn't the art, I said, naturally directed towards seeking and providing for the advantage of each? Yes, that is what it is directed toward. And is there any advantage for each of the arts other than to be as perfect as possible? How do you mean this question? Just as I said, if you should ask me whether it's enough for a body to be a body or whether it needs something else, I would say by all means it needs something else. And the art of medicine has now been discovered because a body is defective, and it won't do for it to be like that. The art was devised for the purpose of providing what is advantageous for a body. So Socrates is now saying, hold on a minute. When we say that somebody is doing a thing or in a role or has a craft, right? Our use of that word indicates that we mean they have an essential task to perform. It's not enough, right, to just carry a stethoscope around. It's not enough to just be on a ship in order to be a pilot or be a doctor, right? You have to be doing the thing that in essence is the art. And he's basically going to now lead us, as you can assume, right, into saying that justice is like that. It's not enough just to be in a position of power, right? The fact that we use the word justice, right, decay in Greek, the fact that we use that word indicates that we mean something specific, some nature of the thing, which aims at fixing a defect. Just the way health, medicine is an art that's designed to bring the body out of its bad state into its good state, right? Or from a worse state into a better state. Surely justice must be aimed at something in that same way, right? And effectively, he goes on to say, well, the ruled, right? Thrasymachus, you have it exactly backward, right? If a ruler is in the business of ruling, right? And if ruling is an art, and if justice is the kind of way that that art is done well then, surely that must mean that he's in the business of benefiting of serving his subjects. And so this is where we get the idea flipped around that actually the good ruler, the just ruler, is the one not who looks to his own advantage, but who looks to the advantage of his citizens. This is actually, this seems basic and obvious because it is so basic to the way that we think about political philosophy. But you can see Thrasymachus and our own modern sophists, right, who want to say that, it's all just power all the way down, right? You can see that this is not obvious. This is something that had to be hammered out in large part in this book, right? Thrasymachus becomes increasingly frustrated. As you would expect, somebody who thinks that arguments are just about power, right, feels very angry. And this is a wonderful portrait, actually, when you talk about, the social justice warriors who get angry when you confront them with sort of calm reason and logic, right? This is, if you think that all arguments are about power, then you feel that losing an argument is about being dominated and subjected. And this is not what Socrates believes, but it's what Thrasymachus believes. And so he becomes increasingly furious. And he pulls out this very dark metaphor. So he says, when we came to this point in the argument, and it was evident to everyone that the argument about the just had turned around in the opposite direction, that is, from the benefit of the powerful, which is what Thrasymachus says, to the benefit of the ruled, which is what Socrates is saying, right? Thrasymachus, instead of answering, said, "Tell me, Socrates, do you have a wet nurse?" "Why this?" I said. "Shouldn't you answer instead of asking such things?" "Because," he said, "she neglects your sniveling nose and doesn't give it the wiping you need. Since it's her fault, you do not even recognize sheep or shepherd." "Because of what in particular?" I said. "Because you suppose," this is Thrasymachus, "you suppose shepherds or cowherds consider the good of the sheep or the cows and fatten them and take care of them looking to something other than their master's good and their own. And so you also believe that the rulers in the cities, those who truly rule, think about the ruled differently from the way the man would regard sheep. And that night and day they consider anything else than how they will benefit themselves. And you are so far off about the just and justice and the unjust and injustice that you are unaware that justice and the just are really someone else's good, the advantage of the man who is stronger and rules, and a personal harm to the man who obeys and serves." So this is, the essence of the relativist position, the sophist position in naked clarity, right? Is that the ruler is just a man who fattens up sheep to be slaughtered. And again, I want to emphasize, right? I don't think that this is just the historical Thrasymachus that Plato is channeling here. He's bringing Thrasymachus into this as a character because he needs himself and he needs us to find answers to these questions, right? And he needs that because of the potential bitterness and cynicism that could arise after seeing the terrible failure of justice that had been carried out right in front of his eyes. Imagine the disillusionment if the city that was supposed to be, your stronghold of justice, your mother and your friend, right? We all want our politeia, our political community, to be lovable, to be worthwhile, and to see it fail in this terrible way, to destroy the man you love so, to kill Socrates, must have been a terrible temptation to cynicism and to Thrasymachian angst, right? And so by putting in Socrates, this argument against Thrasymachus, it almost feels to me like Plato is reminding himself, right? He's saying, no, Socrates didn't believe this. Socrates believed in the just so much that he was willing to go to his death for it. And so here's Socrates sort of turning this around again on Thrasymachus. He says, as it is, Thrasymachus, you see that, still considering what went before, after you had first defined the true doctor, you later thought it no longer necessary to keep a precise guard over the true shepherd. Rather, you think that he, insofar as he is a shepherd, fattens the sheep, not looking to what is best for the sheep, but like a guest who is going to be feasted, to good cheer, or in turn to the sale, like a money-maker, and not a shepherd. The shepherd's art surely cares for nothing but providing the best for what it has been set over. For that the art's own affairs be in the best possible way is surely adequately provided for, so long as it lacks nothing of being the shepherd's art. Now, if you are a Christian or if you have read the Gospels, you will be thinking here about the Good Shepherd, right? And I am not at all suggesting that Jesus read Plato, that Jesus, the man in his life, read Plato, but I am saying, right, that this same insight is sort of throbbing in the background here, that Thrasymachus is saying, well, shepherds just fatten sheep up to eat them. And Socrates is saying, no, that's not the essence of shepherding. Just the same way that exerting power is not the essence of ruling, right? And so when we look to the essence of these things, we look to the good of what they do. And the good of what a ruler does is justice. And we still, remember, haven't gotten around to a real definition of justice. And we're developing in that direction as we sort of dispatch with Thrasymachus. But first, we have to kind of put Thrasymachus aside. And so this idea that the shepherd is actually looking to the good of the sheep translates into the idea that the ruler, in essence, as a ruler, maybe he's another thing. Maybe he's also a tyrant at the same time, right? Maybe he's also a scoundrel. He's doing stuff in that capacity. But in his capacity as a ruler, he is the good shepherd. He is the one that lays down his life for the sheep. What does it mean to organize a city or a person well? And so this is, now that we begin to move beyond Thrasymachus, this becomes the focus of the whole dialogue. And so I'll just read a few more passages before I discuss where we're going from here to the end of book 1. Socrates says, Thrasymachus, it is plain by now that no art or kind of rule provides for its own benefit, but, as we have been saying all along, it provides for and commands the one who is ruled, considering his advantage, that of the weaker, and not that of the stronger. It is for just this reason, my dear Thrasymachus, that I said a moment ago that no one willingly chooses to rule and get mixed up in straightening out other people's troubles, but he asks for wages, because the man who is to do anything fine by art never does what is best for himself, nor does he command it insofar as he is commanding by art, but rather what is best for the man who is ruled. It is for just this reason, as it seems, that there must be wages for those who are going to be willing to rule, either money or honor or a penalty if he should not rule. So he's saying you have to give people something for their rulership, because their rulership does not benefit them, it benefits other people. So you have to give people money or wages or a penalty if they do not rule. And then Glaucon says, the first two kinds of wages I know, but I don't understand what penalty you mean and how you can say it is a kind of wage. Then you don't understand the wages of the best men, I said, on account of which the most decent men rule when they are willing to rule. Or don't you know that love of honor and love of money are said to be and are reproaches? I do indeed. He says it's base, it's low to love money and love honor. For this reason, therefore, I said, the good aren't willing to rule for the sake of money or honor, for they don't wish openly to exact wages for ruling and get called hirelings, nor on their own secretly to take a profit from their ruling and get called thieves. Nor, again, will they rule for the sake of honor, for they are not lovers of honor. Hence, necessity and a penalty must be there in addition for them. If they are going to be willing to rule, it is likely that this is the source of its being held to be shameful to seek rule and not to await necessity. And the greatest of penalties is being ruled by a worse man, if one is not willing to rule oneself. So he's saying the way to incentivize good rulership, and this is where the dialogue begins its long course veering off toward utopianism, right? This idea that the people ought to rule because if they don't, somebody worse will do it, right? And they are so good and so excellent that they must rule. Now, we are going to start talking more as we progress through the dialogue about where that utopianism takes us, whether it's serious or not, right? But for now, I just wanted to get you into the dialogue, into the doors of this great temple. And I will read one last passage that will help us to think going forward about what justice is, and how we evaluate the good, the virtue of a society. Remember, we've been talking about what doctors do in essence and what shepherds do in essence, and comparing those crafts to the crafts of ruling. Socrates says, let's consider this now. Is there some work of a soul that you couldn't ever accomplish with any other thing that is? For example, managing, ruling, and deliberating, and all such things. Could we justly attribute them to anything other than a soul, and assert that they are peculiar to it? To nothing else. And further, what about living? Shall we not say that it is the work of a soul? Most of all, he said. Then do we say that there is also some virtue of a soul? We do. Then, Thrasymachus, will a soul ever accomplish its work well if deprived of its virtue, or is that impossible? Impossible. Then a bad soul necessarily rules and manages badly, while a good one does all these things well. And this is going to come up again later in the Nicomachean Ethics, which is a work we've already studied, right? That virtue, and in this case, justice as a virtue, is what it is to be good at being a person, that is, at being a soul. And you embody that in the world through your body, but your soul is the thing which fundamentally does ruling and leadership. And this is where we begin to develop this direct line between personal rulership of the self, and governance of the soul, with governance of the city. And the more we exert our self-control over our passions and our appetites, right, and use our reason to guide that, the more we are modeling in miniature what it looks like to rule a city well. And the idea that is going to come out here is related to the Cephalus thing, but not quite. It's in Latin, it's called suum cuique, which is each his own, essentially. The idea that each part of a city, of a person, of a soul is doing the thing that it's supposed to do. And so this is why I always talk to you all the time about putting your own house in order first, and why I always cite that Aristotelian thing that the basis, the bedrock of a civilization is the household. It's in here, it's in the Republic, right? This idea that putting things in order, having reason govern, and having thumos, which is their kind of manly energy and spirit, execute, and then having the appetites obey. This is essentially good because these things were made in that structure. They're designed to work that way. And that's justice in a soul. It's the same thing in a city. That is what we will begin to get to as we move on through this dialogue. But the main message, right, is put your own house in order first. There is such a thing as right and wrong. You can exert it today in your soul, in the choice that you make tomorrow when you wake up. And that is actually the rudiment of putting our country and our world back on track. Okay, let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals. If you are not already a part of the Young Heretics community on Locals, I strongly advise you to come join us. There is so much going on there. It's such a great community. Sign up to become a VIP. It's $56 for the whole year, and that's 4 months free if you pay for the whole year up front. So youngheretics.com/locals. Let's hear a mailbag question from a VIP. This is from Falderall. And he, I assume it's a he, although I don't know, says, how do we pass between Scylla and Charybdis, between the purity spiral of cancel culture and the exotic spiral of diversity, inclusion, etc.? So I think what Falderall is asking about here is that we have these sort of two crazy extreme impulses. One is, right, that diversity is our strength, and the most exotic, weird, different thing is what we should be focusing on, because that shows just how liberal we are, how big and open-minded. And then at the same time, right, there's actually this incredibly narrow set of ideas that are acceptable within our kind of woke institutions. And if you deviate from them even a little bit, if you suggest that maybe like every kind of sexual arrangement is not just as good as every other, well, I don't know. I would say that the answer to this is we shouldn't be concerned with either of these. But neither of these has anything to do. This is why this show, Young Heretics, is structured the way it is. It's why at the very beginning of the show I said the whole point is to get that as much out the door as possible, because it's such a distraction, right? Because you're getting arguing about like, well, should we have this or that rule about safe spaces, or should we, be sensitive to this other thing? Like, all of it is garbage. All of it is nonsense. It arises out of this capital T theory, this, Judith Butler gender theory plus sort of social, cultural, Marxist racial theory. None of it is coherent. That's why it becomes a Scylla and Charybdis. Our job is to pay as little attention to that as possible. And that is how we fight back, right? We fight back by not actually caring whether somebody accuses us of racism, but caring instead about the truth of things, the truth of our heart, the truth of whether we genuinely are, right, judging people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. So I would say that really the remedy is what we do on this show, and that is reading and talking about stuff that matters. Truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters. That's the whole point. That's why I frame this the way I do, is that you're already losing if you're arguing between, well, which of these things is worse or better. Scylla and Charybdis is right? Because you have to pass by one in the end, and it always destroys you. So I would say sweep the whole thing off the deck. Stop worrying about what the left is doing. Stop worrying about what the crazy cancel culture people are doing. They have no good ideas. They do not matter. You don't need to engage with them. All you need to do is plow forward into the future and do the building that we've been talking about for the last couple episodes on this show. I hope that helps answer your question. I hope that puts a little kick in your pants, steel in your spine. Thank you, Folderall, for being a VIP. It's a great question. And I will see you on Locals. If you're not on Locals yet, go now, youngheretics.com/locals to become a VIP and enter more deeply into the conversations we have on this show. It's such a joy to be with you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you have not already, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. Give us a 5-star review on iTunes. That really helps. Spreading the word about the show really, really helps. If you like this message, if you believe it deserves to be shared, and I believe that, then I hope you will tell people on social media or in your life. Thanks again. One more time, if you like the show, if you like the stuff we do on this show, then you will love the Claremont Institute. That is the think tank where I work for the recovery of the American ideals and the founding ideals. And you can go to claremont.org/donate to help support us. If you like, let us know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. And you should check out the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, both of which are publications of the Claremont Institute. I work there, and a bunch of really smart people publish fascinating writing there as well. Thanks again for listening. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.